Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to immerse ourselves in a great body of wisdom that lies both in a text before us, in a oral heritage that we bring to the table with us, and also in the faces of all those who are present before us as well. This is the first night of Hanukkah, and we are going to begin by lighting our candles as a demonstration of our capacity to bring light into an often all too dark world. If you have a Hanukkah, I invite you to light first the shamas, and then we'll say blessings. And we will have 3 blessings this evening, as it is the first night, and we begin with this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Chanukah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim lavoteinu mayamim chahem ba'azeh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu l'zman hazeh. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. Thanks to each and every one of you for the light that you bring into this world. Our Torah portion this week is Vayeshev, and he settled. It's found in the book of Genesis, beginning with chapter 37, verse 1. We sang our blessings for the opportunity of immersing ourselves in this body of wisdom. If you'd like to unmute at this time, and together we can recite our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav. I'm sorry, I was got mixed up with our blessing. So we'll just.
You do great, Torah.
Thank you.
Right at the beginning.
I'm going to invite someone else to lead our Torah blessing for this. Dave, would you like to do that?
Yeah, let's see. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu
melech haolam
Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu
la'asok
la'asok b'divrei
Torah.
What a wonderful, wonderful thing that we've got so many blessings that we recite this evening. That's in some ways, I found myself stumbling over them, a richness of blessings. So thank you all very much for your patience, your indulgence, your corrections. I know that I can always count on each and every one of you to aid me when I stumble. Thank you so much. We are in Parshat Vayeshev, Genesis chapter 37, verse 1. We'll read through the English translation. I'll share with you a focus study about it, and then we'll have our collective conversation about it. I'll share with you the opening verses, and then I'll invite others to have an opportunity to read as well. Now Jacob settled in the land where his father had sojourned, the land of Canaan. This then is the line of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph best of all his sons, for he was the child of his old age. and he had made him an ornamented tunic. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of his brothers, they hated him, so that they could not speak a friendly word to him. Kath, would you like to continue at verse 5?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Once Joseph had a dream which he told to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright. Then your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheaf." His brothers answered, "Do you mean to reign over us? Do you mean to rule over us?" And they hated him even more for his talk about his dreams. He dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have had another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." And when he told it to his father and brothers, his father berated him. "What," he said to him, "is this dream you have dreamed? Are we to come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow low to you to the ground?" So his brothers were wrought up at him, and his father kept the matter in mind.
Thank you, Kath. Richard, would you like to read at verse 12?
Yes, Rabbi. One time, when his brothers had gone to pasture their father's flock at Shechem, Israel said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing at Shechem. Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "I am ready." And he said to him, "Go and see how your brothers are, and how the flocks are faring, and bring me back word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. When he reached Shechem, a man came up upon him wandering in the fields. The man asked him, "What are you looking for?" He answered, "I'm looking for my brothers. Could you tell me where they're pasturing?" The man said, "They've gone from here, for I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say a savage beast devoured him. We shall see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard it, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood, cast him into the pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves," intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. When Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic that he was wearing, and took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it.
Thank you. Joan, would you like to read at verse 25?
Thanks. Then they sat down to a meal. Looking up, they saw that a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and landrum to be taken to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let us do away with him ourselves. But let us not do away with him ourselves. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed. When Midianite traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the pit. They sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he rent his clothes. Returning to his brothers, he said, "The boy is gone. Now what am I to do?" Then they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a kid, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They had the ornamental tunic taken to their father, and they said, "We found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and said, "My son's tunic. A savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast." Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down mourning to my son in Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him. The Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of the Pharaoh, and his chief steward.
Thank you. And June, would you like to start there at the beginning of chapter 38?
Thank you, Rabbi. About that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hittah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and cohabited with her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him She conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. Once again she bore a son and named him Shelah. He was at Chesib when she bore him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to the Lord, and the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, "Join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law, and provide offspring for your brother." But Onan, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was displeasing to the Lord, and he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house.
Thank you so much. Dave, would you like to continue there at verse 12?
Oh, excuse me. A long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When her period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheepherders, together with his friend Hirah the Adullamite. And Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing." So she took off her widow's garb and covered her face with a veil, and wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, where she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. "What," she asked, "will you pay for sleeping with me?" He replied, "I will send a kid from my flock." But she said, "You must leave a pledge until you have sent it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she replied, "Your seal and cord and the staff which you carry." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb.
Thank you, Dave. Rose, would you like to continue at verse 20?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he could not find her. He inquired at the council of that locale, "Where's the prostitute, the one at Enaim by the road?" But they said, "There's been no prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I could not find her. Moreover, the local council said there has been no prostitute here." Judah said, "Let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. I did send her this kid, but you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is pregnant from harlotry." "Bring her out," said Judah. "She should be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. Espy the man to whom these belong, that I am pregnant. And she added, examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, she is more right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again.
Thank you. Marty, would you like to continue at verse 27 and take us also into chapter 39?
Thank you, Rabbi. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread on that hand to signify this one came out first. But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out, on whose hand was the crimson thread. He was named Zerah. When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, a certain Egyptian, Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh, and his chief steward, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had lent success to everything he undertook, he took a liking to Joseph. He made him his personal attendant and put him in charge of his household, placing in his hands all that he owned. And from the time that the Egyptian put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed his house for Joseph's sake, so that the blessing of the Lord was upon everything that he owned, in the house and outside. He left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and with him there, he paid attention to nothing save the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome.
Thank you, Marty. And Robert, would you like to continue there at verse 7?
Yes, thank you. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither that he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by the garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, see, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out.
Thank you so much, Robert. Justin, would you like to continue at verse 19?
Thank you, Rabbi. Now it came about when his master heard his wife's report that she spoke to him, saying, your slave did such things to me, that his wrath burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were imprisoned. And he was there in the prison. The Lord was with Joseph, and he extended charisma to him, and he gave him favor in the eyes of the warden of the prison. So the warden of the prison delivered all the prisoners who were in the prison into Joseph's hand. And whatever they did there, he was the one who did it. The warden of the prison did not inspect anything that was in Joseph's hand, for the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made prosper.
Please continue. Thank you.
Now it came about after these events that the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and the baker sinned against their master, against the king of Egypt. And Paro became incensed at his two chamberlains, at the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he placed them in prison of the house of the chief of the slaughterers into the prison, the place where Joseph was imprisoned. And the chief of the slaughterers appointed Joseph to be with them, and he served them. And they were a year in prison.
Thank you. Let me ask Jim if you continue at verse 5.
Thank you, Rabbi. When they had been in custody for some time, both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, dreamed in the same night, each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were distraught. He asked Pharaoh's courtiers who were with him in custody in his master's house, saying, "Why do you appear downcast today?" And they said to him, "We had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." So Joseph said to them, "Surely God can interpret. Tell me your dreams."
Thank you so much, Jim. Let me invite Jay, if you'd like to continue there at verse 9.
Thank you, Rabbi. Then the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. He said to him, "In my dream, there was a vine in front of me. On the vine were 3 branches. It had barely budded when out came its blossoms, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will pardon you and restore you to your post. You will place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as was your custom formerly when you were his cupbearer. But think of me when all is well with you again, and do me the kindness of mentioning me to Pharaoh, so as to free me from this place. For in truth, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, nor have I done anything here that they should have put me in the dungeon."
Thank you so much, Jay. And Catherine, would you like to continue there at verse 16?
Thank you, Rabbi. When the chief baker saw how favorably he had interpreted, he said to Joseph, "In my dream, similarly, there were 3 open work baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of food for Pharaoh that a baker prepares, and the birds were eating it out of the basket above my head." Joseph answered, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale you upon a pole, and the birds will pick off your flesh. On the 3rd day, his birthday, Pharaoh made a banquet for all the officials, and he singled out his chief cupbearer and his chief baker from among the officials, his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not think of Joseph. He forgot him.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. That's our entire Torah portion for the week. I'd like to share with you the focus study that's compiled on our study sheet. If you have a copy, I invite you to take it out now. I've entitled this week's study session, The Bewildering of Serene Faith. We'll explore as we go through this why I chose that title and what I see happening here. So I go to the very beginning of our Torah portion as my landing point and place of focus for this week's study. The name of the Torah portion is Vayeshev. And indeed, that's the very first word in Hebrew in our Torah portion, Vayeshev Yaakov. And he settles there. He settles where? He settles in the land of Canaan. Well, this is remarkable because this has been the whole destination that was first promised to Abraham and is now being reached by Jacob. And so you would think, now we've reached this wonderful point of culmination, of climax, of resolution of a journey, landing in and settling in the land of Canaan. And then in verse 2, we have these words in Hebrew, Ele Todot Yaakov. This is the line of Jacob. Now, we have encountered this previously, just in one of our previous section, where we had this section, I believe it was Justin who read it, Todot Esav. This is the line of Esau. And then it listed these 43 verses worth of family that descended from Esau. And we remarked about, isn't that special that Torah is willing to spend 43 verses describing all the members of this family who eventually are going to be kind of written out of the official story, and in terms of Jewish tradition become, in fact, a source of conflict to the line of Jacob. And here we have this phrase, Ele Todot, so we might expect, maybe here too, just like with Ele Todot Esav, we're going to have now a description of all the people that descended from Jacob. But it's used very differently. That phrase is used very differently in this week's Torah portion, because what immediately follows Ele Todot Yaakov is a description of all this turmoil that occurs within Jacob's family. We learn immediately about Joseph and how Joseph brought bad reports about his older brothers back to the father, about how the father preferred this younger child, about how all the other brothers consequently hated Joseph for being the favored son. So instead of getting, as we did previously, this lovely long description of all these, this lineage of Esau, here we immediately take this phrase as a source of introduction into the strife and turmoil and dysfunction that appears to be happening within Jacob's family. So this, of course, generates a lot of provocation on the commentators. Why is it being presented this way? What is going on here? And what is being revealed about perhaps the nature of human existence? So we have as our first commentator, number one, the medieval commentator Rashi, who takes the phrase, and Jacob settled. And Rashi writes, after Scripture has written for you of the settling of Esau, it explains for you the settlings of Jacob and his offspring. Jacob sought to dwell in tranquility, but then the roges in Hebrew of Joseph sprung upon him. The righteous seek to dwell in tranquility, but the Holy Blessed One said, The righteous do not consider that which prepared for them in the world to come to be enough for them. They seek to dwell in tranquility in this world as well. So here, Rashi, using Midrash, is kind of, in a sense, having introducing the divine voice, acting with a sense of either shock or outrage or disbelief, that righteous people not only want to have a great life in the hereafter, where they are at peace and all is sense of reunited and everything is good, they also want to experience that in this world, in this dimension as well. And so this seems to be setting up for us this notion that this is a reach too far, a presumption too much to be able to expect to have a sense of complacency, of calmness, of ongoing resolution in this world as well. In a sense, what's happening is the Torah is speaking, as Rashi presents it, with kind of an ironic voice. What? You think everything is just going to be resolved and peaceful and everything is just going to be a smooth path from here on? This notion of an ironic voice is actually one that we're going to explore in our artist Magritte as well in a few minutes. But it's interesting to think about irony and the different ways in which irony can express itself. Irony can either express itself with a sense of mocking. What? This is what the way you thought things were going to be? Or it can be expressed with a kind of a voice of compassion. Ah, you thought everything was just going to be solved. I understand that's what you were hoping for, but that's not really the way things work out. So the nature of that voice could be portrayed in very different ways. So let's explore how at least one other commentator, the Hasidic commentator known as Mei HaShiloach, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, whom we've encountered in previous sessions, is going to take this. And that's number 2 in our study sheet. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe says, quotes again from our opening verse, Jacob settled in the land of Canaan, in the land of his father's sojournings. And then the Ishbitzer Rebbe comments, he settled in the land of his father's fear and in the land of Canaan of humility, and he sought to dwell in peace. This kind of peace behaves when a person behaves in such a way as to keep far from all doubt and guards himself from any evil act. That's the modality of that kind of peace. But in response to Jacob's desire for such peace, God told him that as long as a human being lives in a bodily experience, it is impossible to behave with extreme wariness and fear and humility. For God wants human acts, and in this world, human beings must act in love in ways that are not completely clarified. So here's where I think the Ishbitzer Rebbe is now pointing us. He's taken, first of all, some playfulness with some of the Hebrew by taking the words, the father's sojournings, Megure Aviv, and then points out that the same 3 letters in Hebrew that give us the verb to sojourn also give us a very different verb, which is to stir up strife. And so a ger is a sojourner, but magur is also fear or terror. So he's taken this lovely the coincidence of this Hebrew, of these Hebrew words, and is now saying what Jacob has done is he is settled within a place of fear, an anxiety about what could happen within one's life. And in that sense, what Jacob has been trying to do as in terms of being in a place of fear is to hide oneself, to wall oneself off from anything that might disturb what little bit of peace he thinks he has found. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe is basically saying, what happens when you do that is you become small, a small person. And that is, in effect, another playing on words that the Ishbitzer Rebbe is doing. He's taking the word Canaan and looking at the Hebrew word kana, which means humility, small. And so it becomes a shrinking of the self to live in a place of fear. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe says, when you do that, you minimize who you are and you minimize the gift that God has given you, which is the opportunity to live fully, to take risks, and to begin to expand oneself psychologically and spiritually. And what Jacob is doing is he's afraid of what might happen. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe is saying, well, that's what life is all about. Life is full of lack of clarity about what's going to happen next. You can never be certain about what's going to happen next. And if you live by walling yourself off from these risks, you are diminishing yourself. And by doing so, you're desecrating the divine. And so what the Ishbitzer Rebbe says is, God doesn't want you to live in fear. God doesn't want you to live as a totally humble person. God wants you to be courageous. God wants you to act in the face of the unknown. And that the Ishbitzer Rebbe seems to associate with the notion of what love is all about. Because love is not based upon a knowing and a clarity about what's going to happen next when you embrace a person that way. Love is an embrace of another human being without knowing what the future holds. And that seems to be what the Ishbitzer Rebbe is encouraging us to do. Number 3 is a quote from our current and contemporary commentary of Viva Zernberg from her book, The Beginnings of Desire. And she develops this a little bit further and talks about how only a vision in which the plot is unclear, and then she has this lovely phrase, in which anomalies bewilder serene faith and integrities are torn apart, can open the possibility of human action. This notion about torn apart is very graphically represented in our portion here, when the brothers bring home this bloodied cloak of Joseph, and they say, he was torn apart by a beast. And so Aviva Zornberg is developing this notion about how it's only when things are torn apart that we can develop ourselves and exercise the level of responsibility that the divine has given to us. So she writes, in a sense, God turns Jacob's quest away from philosophy, from the search for certainties, to the world of poetry. Poetic language is the loving act of the human being who seeks to redescribe his reality in the midst of and against teruf, tearing, which is the word that's used in Hebrew here when Jacob sees the torn cloak. The notion of philosophy that Aviva Zornberg here is describing is a system that tries to account for everything, to explain for everything, to create a system that is totalized, if you will. And she contrasts that with poetry which is using words that we're familiar with, but placing them in relationships and in forms that are unusual to us. So in number 4, I have some verses from a poem by William Wordsworth called Surprised by Joy. Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, I turn to share the transport. Oh, with whom but thee, long buried in the silent tomb, that spot which no vicissitude can find. William Wordsworth wrote this poem following the death of his young daughter. So Wordsworth, in order to try and deal with the death of this beautiful child whom he loves so much, he turns to poetry as a way to not only move through this moment of deep, profound loss, but also perhaps as a way to begin to reintegrate his world, to try and move through the world of loss and fracture and tearing, and perhaps to begin to reassemble it using the word of poetry. Now, to bring this to our painting and to this moment that we're in right now. So we're celebrating this holiday of Hanukkah, which as a child, I was raised to understand this is a story about heroic people called the Maccabees who fought a people who had invaded the land of Israel, refused to allow them to worship in the Jewish way. And they were not only able to defeat them, but the climax was the discovery of oil in the temple that had been desecrated, but only enough pure sanctified oil to last one night, but it lasts 8 days. And that's why we light these 8 candles over 8 days of Hanukkah. But as a student in rabbinic school, I learned there were other layers to that story. There was a first book of Maccabees, a second book of Maccabees, both of which were Jewishly composed, but none of which wind their way into the Jewish canon. And they tell a very different story than the one I learned as a child. One of them tells a story about great heroic battles and the defeat of the invading army of Antiochus and the celebration of 8 days, but it gives no reason why it was celebrated that way. And then another book which says, yes, so emphasizes more the religious and spiritual aspects of these days and says, yes, and 8 days was celebrated, and the reason it was celebrated, it hints at, is because we weren't able to celebrate the Camping Out Festival, another name for Sukkot, which is also an 8-day festival because of wartime conditions. So there are these different storylines, different interpretations, different references that complexify what, for me as a child, had been a very simple and serenely explained, uncomplicated story. So here's our painting on the front. It is by the great surrealist René Magritte, the Belgian surrealist. And this is a painting, La Cinquième Saison. And this is a painting that, interestingly enough, he does late in his career. He starts off as a surrealist. And in 1943, perhaps in response to all the turmoil of World War II, including the invasion of his home country, he rejects the way he had been painting for decades. He rejects the surrealist orthodoxy and begins experimenting with different forms. And here, in this one in particular, is the influence of the Impressionist painter Renoir. And he seems to adopt more of a hazy, gentle, soft palette and style than his previous style. And in terms of the subject, it is interesting. Here are 2 figures wearing bowler hats, each of them carrying a painting, and they are heading towards one another. These are either different individuals, each holding a painting, and they are either going to cross one another or bump into one another, or perhaps it is the same person, perhaps Magritte himself, who has now become, in Jacob's terms, two camps. You remember we read that last week. I've become two camps. So maybe this is, as Jacob experienced it, a split within himself, carrying his old self, the possibilities of his new self. Perhaps this is Jacob now encountering and wrestling with a higher self to see which will emerge. But these are two aspects of this man Magritte. And you may not be able to see in the representation that you have before you, but the figure on the left is holding a painting that's primarily a scene in a woods. And if one could see a very clear version of it, you'd see that it's painted in an impressionistic style. And the figure on the right is holding another painting, which has primarily clouds, sky, and clouds. And perhaps that's meant to evoke that which inspired Magritte in the first place, and that is the work of Freud and his study of dreams and the unconscious. So maybe this is Magritte's new self and old self. They are now conjoining, they are now conflicting, they are now meeting one another, encountering one another, and who knows what will come out of that. Indeed, what eventually does come out of it in terms of Magritte's own career is he goes on in the 50s and 60s to paint some of his greatest surrealist paintings. He has, it's not going back to his old style. He develops an entirely more clarified, if you will, style for his surrealist paintings. The other thing that's fascinating about this painting is just this past year, researchers at a museum in Belgium discovered that there was another painting underneath this one, another layer with another painting, and it's a portrait of a woman. We don't know who that woman is. It might have been his wife, Georgette, we don't know. The notion that in order to have this new recreation of self, Magritte not only paints two figures who are about to engage one another, but they are painted on top of another painting. So I bring all this together as a way to share perhaps what the lesson that I got out of this week's study session is that serene faith is not the way that Torah seems to be pointing us. And if, in a sense, the Torah is speaking with a voice of irony, perhaps it is the voice that's the irony of Magritte. Magritte's style was to kind of poke fun at what our desires and expectations were for having a very, if you will, middle class, normal life. And he would paint figures and objects that were familiar to us, and then do something or write something in his painting that would disabuse us of our presumptions and expectations about what we were seeing. But his paintings were always not mocking us. There's always a sense of compassion for us and hoping that we will use these opportunities of irony as a way to reconsider what we were really aspiring towards. And I believe that's what's happening in this week's Torah portion. It's a gentle voice reminding us that the true peace that we seek is not attained by withdrawing, by living in fear. It's by living, as the Ishbitzer Rebbe says, with courageous acts of love. And with that, I'd love to know what you saw and what you experienced as we were going through this week's Torah portion and looking at the painting. Please, Catherine.
Yes. I'm going to have a footnote for the painting, but before I get to that, Joseph's coat. I was thinking how it may have transformed in its meaning during this parsha. That first we have him given this coat, which is multicolored and perhaps represents the kind of unity of Jacob's clan, all living together and sort of being protected that way. And then it becomes his identity. In other words, it no longer represents the collectivity, but it becomes his identity when his brothers bring it to the father. But of course, we know that he did not perish, and that in fact, he was not torn, that it's just the coat. And I'm just thinking about this journey to Egypt as a way of sort of reconstituting, in a way, what the coat represents and how he has these multiple identities that he needs to move through before he can come back.
Before you move on to the painting, I just want to, you stimulate me to think more about this, Catherine, because the notion of the cloak, thank you for bringing that up, is a theme that we see repeated in this week's Torah portion.
Okay.
Because we have the cloak at the very beginning of his youth, his exuberance, maybe his narcissism, maybe even his wild disregard for what his actions and his words the impact they may have on those around him. There's that bit. Then we have another cloak, which is that of Tamar. Tamar disguises herself in a cloak.
Yes.
As a way to evince from another justice, if you will. And then cloak for Joseph appears again with Potiphar's wife, and he leaves the cloak in her hand, if you will. And those are all interesting, lovely themes to we could spend an entire session just play with. So thank you very much. So please, you want to say something also about the painting?
Yes, that I noticed as you were speaking about these two camps of the Impressionist camp and the so-called surreal, the clouds and the dreaming, that in fact, if you look at the background, we notice that the left side of the canvas has more vibrant colors, and the right side of the canvas is sort of faded a little bit, sort of grays and whites. And so it just augments that sensation we have.
That's lovely. I mean, that's lovely. The Impressionist side seems to be more vibrant and full of color, and the side that is perhaps the cooler side, if you will, that's representing the unconscious side, the analytic side, if you will. That's fascinating. I hadn't seen that. So thank you very much for pointing it out. Let me call upon Robert, then Rose and Norman. Go ahead, Robert.
Yes, thank you again for a lovely evening. There's so much story and symbolism in tonight's session, beginning to end. So I'm not even going to touch that, but I mean, both of you have touched on it already, but line by line, it's a weekend. I want to address this picture, and I'm so glad you shared that there's a picture of a woman beneath it, because it makes my understanding of what this might symbolize, or what it symbolizes, could symbolize for me, complete. Woman is what gives birth and what gives life. When I look at the man on the left, he doesn't have a beard. The man on the right seems to have a white beard. And whether he has it or not, that's how I understand it. The woman represents birth. I see the man on the left, on the first half of his life. You see, they're right in the middle. He's leaving from his birth. And in those early years, we're so involved in the world. Sometimes we forget about spirituality. Now we see him and it's darker. Now we see him coming from the right to the left, going back to origin. We came from God and unto him do we return, right? And we see now that his picture is filled with light. And he's also the one closer to thee, O God. So I just love the way that this picture fits in with the story that we had tonight, and or all the stories, all the symbolism.
Thank you so much, Robert. Oh, that's very, very rich. Thank you so much. And Rose, and then Norman. Please, Rose.
Well, I want to bring up two things. One is Magritte and the other is dreams. It's interesting that you chose Rene Magritte because one of his most famous pictures is Ceci n'est pas une pipe, which is, this is not a pipe. And there's a picture of a pipe and it says, this is not a pipe. So, you know, we have a lot of this masquerading in here, specifically the sort of Tamar, who I love. She's the most badass woman. She does what needs to be done, but you know, she pretends to be a prostitute as you know, because by all appearances she was, but then, you know, when they tried to find her, there's a prostitute around here, you know. So I mean, so I think that Magritte is interesting. And what you were saying before about that you settle and you think your life is certain, but it's not certain. And what you think something is may not be what it really is. And in this comes the role, I think, of dreams and the interpretation of dreams. Now, Joseph's being a dreamer first gets him into trouble. He gets thrown into the pit because she's interpreting his own dreams and saying, you know, what a good boy am I, you know, and they say, you know, you're full of it, you're the dreamer, you're a pain in the butt, you know, go away. But yet his ability to interpret dreams, which relates him back to Jacob, which may be why Jacob, he's Jacob's favorite kid, because Jacob sees himself in it, because Jacob is also a dreamer. He's also a conniver, he's a lot of things. But then the dreams save him. The ability to interpret dreams, the ability to see what others don't see. That's really, you know, the whole point. This is not a pipe. Maybe it's not. Maybe you need to see in that what others don't see.
Beautiful.
And that's what makes, that's when you're tuning in actually to holiness, to be able to see the unseen.
Oh, very nice, Rose. Thank you very, very much. That's very elegant. Thank you. Let me call upon Norman and then Mark. Norman?
I'm intrigued by the picture. I think I've seen this before and certainly never thought about it very much like I am now. I'm intrigued by it. It's paradoxical. There's two men. I see them as walking past each other based on where the feet are. They're like two ships that are passing in the night, and I ask why. They have so much in common. They're dressed similarly. They both have similar framed pictures. They're wearing similar clothing. They have same hats on, and yet they seem to have no interest in each other. The pictures themselves are interesting. One is darker, one is lighter, yet they have less color and detail in them than the door, the wall, the floor, and even the garments that the people are walking. Whenever there's similar pictures like this, it raises questions in my mind. Are these different pictures? Are they the same pictures that are looked at in different light or painted at different times or in different attitudes? And it reminds me in the Parsha of the recurring themes that I see, of which, gosh, there's a lot of them. There's the lie with me from Tamar and the lie with me from Potiphar's wife, each of which advances the agenda. We wouldn't be able to get anywhere without these. There's the recurring issue of twins, and which twins is coming out first, and which one is going to have prominence. This is very tantalizing in a world of primogeniture, where there's special status which is given to the firstborn, and sometimes we don't really know. It's not clear. There's the recurring theme of hiding identity. Jacob did it with Esav. Tamar does it with Judah. And again, without these episodes of deception, we're not going to get anywhere in the story. There's the issue of garments. Rabbi, you pointed out the two garments that got Joseph into trouble. The first time with his brothers, the second time with Potiphar's wife. And then there's a third episode of garments when he comes to position under Pharaoh, and Pharaoh dresses him up in special garments to signify his status. There's, to me, a recurring theme of breaking down social relationships and then building them up again. There's the breaking down of the family, which will later come together again. There's the breaking down of Joseph's status. You wonder how such a smart guy who is so talented and doesn't have a clue about the people around him and how he's affecting them. But he seems to learn his way around that again. He's broken down in the pit. He's broken down in the prison, and finally he builds himself out of that. We could spend so much time talking about a lot of these things.
Norman, here's I want to express my appreciation to you for what you focused me on in terms of the painting, because what you described in the painting was this millisecond, like half a footstep before the actual encounter between these two beings. And it's unclear, it's unknown whether they're going to walk past one another, or whether they are going to greet one another, or whether they're going to bump into one another, whether they're going to conflict with one another. It's like that half step right before, and so far it is unwritten or unpainted as to what will happen next. And in this week's Torah portion, as you point out, there are a series of encounters. There is the encounters between Jacob and brothers. There's the encounter from last week's portion of Jacob and Esau. Were they going to be at war with one another, or were they going to embrace one another? This moment between Jacob, Judith, and Tamar. Will he recognize her and do what's right, or will he not recognize her and take advantage of her? The encounter between Joseph and Potiphar. Will Joseph give in to this bit of seduction, or will he resist it? So I love this notion about these moments on the painting of right before the outcome of the encounter. And, you know, that's the way our lives are. We have all these encounters, and we get to be the artist. Continually, every day, we get to be the artist as to how we will write or paint the encounters that are available to us. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let me invite Mark Thompson, please.
Hi, everyone. And I'm late because my wife and I had an opportunity to attend a Hanukkah celebration at our community. And a lot of the music that was presented was sung by a choir, primarily of non-Jews. And it was Hanukkah music that they learned. And it just, it gave me a sense of comfort to know that those that are not Jewish are able to support us during these difficult times. I wanted to talk a little bit about light since this is Hanukkah. And I tuned into a very interesting podcast this morning that was presented by Dr. Daniel Gordis. I'm sure some of you are familiar with him. And he was interviewing a professor from Hebrew Union College. Can't remember her name right now. And she's talking about the history of Hanukkah and the way that we should be lighting the Hanukkah, the menorah. And she talked about the two different schools of thought between Hillel and Shammai. Hillel said that when you light the menorah, the shamus is the head candle, of course. You start with the first candle being the first night, and you proceed from there until you complete the lighting for all 8 nights. Shammai, on the other hand, suggested that we do it in reverse. You light all 8 candles the first night and go decreasingly back to the first for the last night. Well, what's the reason for this? I guess there's a psychosocial explanation. Shammai would have said that the light represents the fullness of our abilities when we're born. As it diminishes through time, as we age, the 8 candles suddenly become 1. Hillel, on the other, says, no, we're born with really very little wisdom, but as we grow older, that light increases. And by the time that we're of old age, hopefully, we will have attained that wisdom and the 8 candles of wisdom. So the suggestion was made, maybe we should have 2 menorahs. One where we light the candles 8 first, and then the other where we light 1 candle, have them both there to remind us that that we're both declining in our abilities, and yet we're also increasing in our abilities to become more sympathetic, understanding, and compassionate people, which made me now think about that painting and taking the other point of view that maybe that individual is the same person confronting both sides of the spectrum, both understanding his decline and understanding his increasing abilities.
Beautiful, beautiful. Let me just take that, what the rich comments that you've had there, and say, and posit that perhaps the way in which we light the Hanukkah may relate to what you're saying, which is that we're supposed to add candles going from right to left, but we light them from left to right. In a sense, what's happening is the eldest get placed in the Hanukkah first, but we honor the youngest one by lighting the youngest one first, so that both age and youth are being honored in the way we place and light the candles on the Hanukkah. And so I love that notion, and maybe because our painting here is portraying 2 figures, one going from the right, one coming from the left, maybe there's a notion of honoring that's also happening on the canvas as well. Richard, yes.
Yes, just 2 little things. One is that number 8, of course, you get, for the male, you get born on one day and then 8 days later you get circumcised. So there's something going on there. But these 2, I want to agree with what's been said totally about the 2 figures. And we've talked a lot about the male and female, the male and the female, and the female and the male, and trying to bring them out of repression and into service and acknowledge them both within all our bodies. And I see there coming forward these 2 figures. It's one figure, it's just one person. And this is about, you can't have tranquility because there's compassion down there that needs to be honored. And in order to do that, there's got to be action in the world. And the problem is to synthesize our compassion and our joy for peace. And then there's room for poetic behavior, and there's room for action in the world of sharing love inside. And it's about bringing our unconscious and our conscious together and integrating them.
Wow.
And this is true in Buddhism, where you can't stay in tranquility, in enlightenment, because You're here as a human being, and there's compassion for others, and nobody's enlightened until everyone is. And I believe that artist, in his shift from surrealism to a new way of doing things, is telling us he's not got a new piece of himself that he can now integrate and become a better human and more integrated human being.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm going to try and weave together all the richness that people have shared by just returning to the concluding sentence from the Ishbitzer's commentary on the portion, which after Richard spoke makes him sound more Buddhist than perhaps I had thought of him as. And just to share that final sentence with you, for God wants human acts, and in this world, human beings must act in love in ways that are not completely clarified. I want to thank each and every one of you for acting in ways of love, in the face of perplexity, in the face of lack of clarity, to choose the path that says, that's what love is all about. Love is about no guarantee what happens next, but love is an embrace of one in the face of the perplexity and lack of clarity. Thank you so much, everyone. Happy Hanukkah. Keep lighting the lights. Make the world a brighter place. Thank you so much. God bless you all. Be well.
Happy Hanukkah. Thank
Happy
you, Rabbi.
Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Hug Sameach, everybody.